We're ready to start. Now I told Cole to finish speaking at 7:45, all right? And then we'll have a time for question and answers, and you can stay as long as you want with him. He may be here till 10 o'clock still speaking. I will not, however, be here until 10 o'clock, okay? But 7:45, and maybe 10 of, because it's now 10 past 7, but you know, why not just enjoy our time together? So I want to thank Cole for coming to St. Pius tonight, and despite the bad weather. I think Cole first made contact with Father Patrick.
Yeah.
You know, a while ago. Maybe when you were still at PC, I don't know.
Yeah, this is actually the second time in which I've lectured.
When you were getting your master's in theology from PC.
And I think you were here with the coaches.
Yes.
Oh,
way
oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So, welcome back to that same area, completely beautified.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, Cole describes himself as a lifelong theology student, which is like 20 years, I think, he's been conscious. So 20 years of theology, which is not bad, you know. But very happy to have him. He has I put this in the bulletin, a bachelor's degree in theology, or business, maybe.
Bachelor's in theology.
And business or no? Just
theology.
Oh, good. That's smart. It's a way to do it. Then you have to teach. You can't do much with it, you know. And then a master's in theology from PC, and at Bishop Hendricken. He's a graduate of Bishop Hendricken. For Rhode Islanders, that means something. I take it. At present, Cole, you know, is always available for parish lectures like this, and he teaches theology at Our Lady of Mercy School in East Greenwich. So he teaches with Emily Thompson and under the great Father Healy, whom those of you involved in Rhode Island politics know that Father Healy is the bishop's chaplain to the politicians. He's not doing a very good job, but he's doing the best he can. We're very happy to have Cole speak tonight on psychology and the emotions, a Catholic approach. Is that right?
Yes.
Excellent. So without a further delay, Cole, welcome. Please begin. The timer starts now. Till 7:45, maybe 2 minutes after, I'll say how I'm feeling. I'll check with your mother. And questions and answers, so get some good questions.
So I just have to say thank you so much for bringing me back to your wonderful parish. You know, again, the last time in which I came here was back in 2017 to deliver a lecture series, which I can't believe that was almost half a decade ago. But you know, it was a great time then, and it's going to be a great time now. I have to say, the time restrictions may be a little much. As you guys know, I went to PC. The Dominicans, and also one of my professor here, who's also a Thomist. I am essentially a master of their making, so I'll be making 10 hours of distinctions just to get to my main points, counterpoints.
He's already wasting his time now.
But anyways, so my lecture today is actually on the Catholic view on the emotions, and just Catholic and Christian psychology more generally. And firstly, I have to say, why is any of this important? I mean, it's an interesting subject from a medical perspective, from a philosophical perspective. A lot of people don't think it's necessarily the most spiritual topic. Well, first of all, humans are sentient beings. We're conscious beings. And that probably means we're aware of ourselves and we're aware of our surroundings. And that thus means whenever stuff happens, we respond. So the emotions are they're a part of our life as humans. They're an inevitable and unavoidable aspect of human life. But another reason why I'd like to talk about the emotions is not only is it an issue that we have to address at some point, but over the course of the past few years, this has really been a hot button issue. Now, a lot of you guys have probably heard the stories about how, psychological and mental illnesses through the roof in recent years. For example, there was a 2017 article from Columbia University that showed that rates of depression increased in the period between 2005 and 2015 from 6.6% to 7.3%. Yet the rate of increase was even higher among the youth. For example, when we look at people between the ages of 12 and 17, rates of depression increased from 8.7% to 12.7%, which is a massive increase. There was an article from 2020 from the National Center for Biotechnology Information that showed that anxiety disorders increased from 5.1% in 2008 to 6.8% in 2018, and among people ages 15 to 18, it doubled. And of course, we all know how all the issues with the recent pandemic, with the job insecurity and the social isolation, have also led to increases in rates of depression and all sorts of issues. For example, there was one study, it actually took information from two separate studies, one that was conducted between 2017 and 2018 and showed 75.3, so roughly 3/4 of those who they interviewed or surveyed claims to have like no symptoms of depression. And yet, by April of 2020, that number had decreased to 47%. Meanwhile, the number of people who claimed to have mild symptoms of depression increased from 16.2% to 24.6%, which is an 8.4% increase. And the number of people who claimed to have severe symptoms was the most drastic increase, from less than 1% to about a little over 5%. So again, this is also a hot button issue because, you know, the mental health of our nation is just completely out of kilter. So there's a strong practical motivation as well. But again, some of the more uniquely theological reasons why we should study this are going to become more evident as the lecture goes on. But first we have to begin by defining the concept of emotions. Now, the thing is, with the emotions, the definition of the term emotion is something that we sort of take to be self-evident. Like, I feel emotions. I wake up, and I feel emotions at almost every moment of the day, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed. And then even when I'm asleep, when I'm sleeping, when I'm dreaming, when I'm having dreams, nightmares, so on and so forth. Not only that, but other people feel emotions. And the thing is, I know that you are feeling emotions. And so when I say anger, do I need to explain anger to anyone here? Do I need to explain happiness to anyone here? No. And so the thing is, but if I go up to someone and say, explain to me what emotions are, we'll look at D on the headlines. We don't know how to respond. Because it's almost like, how do you not know what this is? You know, it's like, what's life? What's existence? You know? So actually, let me actually just turn it back on the audience. So, what is an emotion? Who wants to define an emotion?
It's a feeling?
It's a feeling, but what is a feeling? So like, I feel this podium. Is an emotion a feeling in that sort of sense? So what's a feeling? You in the front, what's an emotion? What's a feeling? Anyone? But you see, if I made my point, it's like there's no way to really talk about this issue without either talking in vague terms or in circular terms. Like, I actually was speaking with someone who said, what's a feeling? What's an emotion? They said, it's a feeling. I said, what's a feeling? It's an emotion. And it's like, so let's actually start off with the technical scientific definition of a feeling. So, of an emotion, rather. You look at the American Psychological Association, they actually published a text known as the Dictionary of Psychology. And when you look at the entry for emotions, this is what it had. An emotion is a, quote, complex reaction pattern involving experiential, behavioral, and physiological elements by which an individual attempts to deal with a personally significant matter or event. The specific quality of the emotion, for example, fear or shame, is determined by the specific significance of the event, unquote. So.
That's what I was going to say.
just missed the mark. So, well, now let me break this down for you. You know, again, one thing you gotta know about science, philosophy, theology is it uses a lot of technical jargon. Once you break down the jargon, it really begins to make sense. So basically, an event occurs in our life which we view as significant in some way. And basically, an emotion is a response, it's a reaction to some significant event that causes physical changes, it causes changes in our behavior, and it also causes phenomenological changes, which is basically just a fancy way of saying changes in how we experience stuff. And the extent of the response, and therefore the extent of the change that takes place, and also the nature of the response is also determined by the nature of the event and how significant we deem it to be. So even though this is the standard sort of medical definition of emotion, there's still a lot of things that need to be filled in. And that's where you start to get into philosophy, psychology, and even theology. For example, there was an American philosopher named Martha Nussbaum who wrote a book called Upheavals of Thought, in which she basically said that emotions are a type of thought. Now, a lot of times psychologists and philosophers have suggested that emotions include thoughts, but they're also more than just thoughts. The thing is, she's using the term thought in a kind of broad sense to refer to any kind of cognitive action. So whenever anything happens, which that's it, everybody desires their own well-being and the well-being of others. Whenever something happens to us, which we view as somehow impacting our well-being or the well-being of others, we then make judgments about that, which then leads to some sort of response. And that's sort of what an emotion is. Now, again, Nussbaum kind of makes an important distinction. She says that there's a difference between emotions and feelings. So this is actually why I'm glad you said what you had said earlier, because for someone like Nussbaum, feelings are basically physical experiences. So it's imagine when you feel happy, or not happy, but more energetic or fatigued. That would be a feeling. Whereas an emotion is something like joy, anger, sadness. And the thing about emotions is emotions always have some sort of cognitive object to them. So it's an object that we're making a judgment about, and that's an integral part of emotions. Now, feelings may be physical manifestations of emotions, but they're not the same thing. Now, you go back to the 18th century, and now a little bit of early American history. How many people here have heard of Jonathan Edwards? Well, the name sounds familiar. So yeah, basically a Puritan theologian, probably one of the early greats of American Christianity, especially American Protestantism. But he basically wrote a book called A Treatise on Concerning Religious Affections, in which he basically defined an emotion as something that moves us from a state of indifference to a state of either desiring or being repulsed by a particular object. Basically, when we first experience something, we neither desire nor hate it, but an emotion is something that then moves us to then either be inclined for or against it. And again, there's a lot of questions that he doesn't really answer, that Edwards doesn't really answer. For example, he says emotions incline the will and the intellect. That is what we desire and how we judge things and how we view things. But he never actually says whether or not emotions themselves are actually inclinations. Likewise, he says that emotions can manifest themselves in a physical form, but he never actually spells out what the connection between the emotions and the body is. Now that we've sort of looked at the definition of emotions from a medical perspective, as well as from a philosophical perspective, and again, from the philosophical perspective, one of them is sort of like a secular perspective, the other is sort of like an early attempt of Protestant anthropology. Let's look at the Catholic perspective. I mean, I'm guessing that's the reason why most of you guys are here, right? You want to know what the Catholic perspective is on this? Interestingly, a lot of the definitions I provided kind of approximate the Catholic view, but if you want to know specifically what the Catholic view is, let me actually go through a few different definitions. So, St. Thomas Aquinas, probably one of the greatest medieval theologians of the Catholic tradition, he defined an emotion in the following way: as that whereby one is, and I quote, drawn to that which belongs to the agent, unquote. Father Arthur Divine, now Father Divine really wasn't that, he was kind of well known in his day, not as well known today. He was basically an Irish-born English priest and scholar, mostly active like in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he actually wrote an entry on the nature of emotions for the Catholic Encyclopedia. And he described emotions as, quote, the motions of the sensitive appetite in man which tend towards the attainment of some real or apparent good or the avoidance of some evil, unquote. Now there's a theologian and philosopher named Diana Fritz Cates, and her main area of expertise is like religious ethics and sort of the intersection between theology, philosophy, and psychology. Interestingly, she teaches over in Iowa, but she has a connection to Rhode Island. She got her doctorate from Brown. So again, yeah, I always have to find a way to connect it back to Rhode Island. But and she actually wrote a book in which she provided a commentary on St. Thomas Aquinas' view, and this was her definition, quote, an emotion is a motion of the soul-body composite. It is a motion that occurs with respect to the appetitive dimension of an embodied soul. In other words, it is a motion that occurs through the exercise of one's appetitive powers, unquote. So, again, sounds like a kind of highfalutin definition, so let me break it down. So, now I know at least two people in this room know the distinction I'm about to make before I even say it, but you know what? An important part to understanding this definition is understanding what it means for humans, or just living things in general, to be soul-body composites. And to understand that, you have to understand the concept of the distinction between matter and form. So matter is like the physical stuff out of which you are made. That's matter. A form is sort of like that which organizes and arranges the matter in such a way so that it's an intelligible, singular, unified whole. So take, for example, this podium. The matter of this podium would be wood. But then, it's not just a bunch of wood just piled here. The wood is organized in a specific way. And so the principle that allows the matter to be organized in a very specific way, that's the form. Okay, so you follow me? So again, the one thing about St. Thomas Aquinas, and just the Catholic view since Aquinas, is that it's very straightforward, it's very intuitive. Now we have to get into souls. So the soul is the form of a living thing, which, what does that mean? Well, if a particular piece of matter is organized and arranged in such a way so that it's considered a living thing, the form of that would be what's called a soul. So basically, we know that when matter interacts with each other in just the right way, it forms a living thing. There are certain physical things that are needed for a thing to be considered living. And so when that's arranged in such a way, just the right way, the form of that is called a soul. So the soul is a form of a living thing. Now, the important thing to remember is that with this definition in mind, and again, that sounds like that old-timey like Baptist piano music, so this is a religious event, so we need that kind of music. Anyways, hopefully by the end there'll be some sort of a Bible going on in here, but anyways, but with that definition in mind, you know, we can honestly say that every living thing has a soul. So I have a soul, bacteria have a soul, Fido has a soul, every living thing has a soul. The thing is though, when you look at plants or bacterial life, they only have the ability to grow, to reproduce, to take stuff from outside the body, absorb it into their own body, and use it to sustain their basic bodily processes. But then when you look at an animal has all these capacities, plus it has an added capacity, namely the ability to perceive the outside world via the senses and certain sort of basic cognitive abilities that go along with that. Humans, on the other hand, have something above even that, and that's what's called reason. So reason is the capacity for abstraction. Reason is the ability to understand those realities which are not immediately perceptible to the senses. Think about logical truths, metaphysical truths, moral truths. You know, animals have the capacity to think. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make is say animals don't have the ability to think. They do. But it's basically like they perceive something through the senses and then they make judgments about how to respond, or basic calculations about how to do things, how to avoid things, how to obtain things. Humans have the capacity to judge by a higher set of principles. We can think in terms of logic. We can think in terms of morality, of spiritual things. Now let me ask you something. Point to the part of your body where you can perceive God, or perceive the law of non-contradiction. So do I have to do head, shoulders, knees, and toes? Can I see it? Can I see metaphysics?
No.
Can I smell it? No. Basically, and I'm sorry if this is coming off as a little bit patronizing, but I just got off of 6 hours of teaching middle school. So.
You can smell that.
But basically, there's no physical organ that helps people to understand spiritual or logical or moral truths. So, because those things are not physical in nature, right? So basically, because they're not physical, like they can't be directly perceived through some physical medium. So basically, while it's true that there is a connection between the mind and certain physical parts of the body, which is why we know that whenever you think or feel or whatever, there is brain activity, nonetheless, the actual reason in and of itself, because its object is not physical, reason itself can't be physical. So there has to be a part of the soul that is not entirely reducible to the body, and which therefore can survive independent of the destruction or corruption of the body. Therefore, we say about the soul that humans have, which is called a rational soul, that it can survive past death. Now, nonetheless, because the rational soul is immortal, a lot of people tend to think that what makes us really human is the soul, and the body's just sort of incidental to that, you know? Which is not true. Does anyone kind of know the name of the heresy that says that? Manichaeanism, Gnosticism. Manichaeanism being a type of Gnosticism. So basically, it's this vaguely related to that would be sort of the view of Plato, who kind of believed that we need to escape the body, though he never took it as extreme as the Gnostics. But what makes humans unique is the fact that we have both bodies and souls. So that's why a lot of people describe humans, and just living things in general, as soul-body composites. And so with that in mind, you can kind of understand the core definition of what an emotion is. Because an emotion, if you can remember what I said, like 10 minutes ago, is that it's a motion of a soul-body composite towards or away from something deemed to be good or harmful. So there's sort of two parts to this. Well, really three if you consider one of them is subdivided further. But the first part has to do with cognition. So basically, we perceive something, you judge it to either be good or bad, desirable or harmful, and that's always apprehension. So you perceive something and you make judgments about it, right? But then, once you make a judgment about something, that inclines the will either for or against it. That's known as the appetite. So basically, I have a Thomas and a Dominican here, and they're both kind of nodding like so.
They're the same thing. That's well.
So basically, that's the thing. So you see apprehension followed by appetite. And then once the will becomes disposed either for or against something, then this causes a reaction in the body. So take, for example, when you feel joy. You perceive something, so that's apprehension. You then make a judgment about it as something good, which is appetite. And then what happens is, once you've made a decision about something as being good, you pursue it, and then you end up feeling like your body releases certain chemicals, such as serotonin, which produces a sense of euphoria, or more like serotonin or dopamine. I think it's more dopamine, which actually creates a sense of emotional well-being and euphoria. Or take, for example, on the other hand, something like anger, which is basically like you judge something to be threatening, and then, so you first perceive something, you judge it to be threatening, and then, after you've judged it to be threatening, you then become inclined to either fight against it or to avoid it, which then causes in our body the release of hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which essentially prepare the body for essentially a fight or flight sort of thing. So there's a lot more distinctions that could be made, because there's different types of emotions, and there's also different types of apprehension and appetite. For example, humans have reason. So we have the ability to understand certain goods and make judgments in accordance with principles greater than just, am I going to survive? Like an animal just judges in terms of survival for me and then reproduction. And so this introduces a whole other new set of distinctions. It talks about like intellectual appetite, intellectual apprehension versus sensory appetite. I don't think we'll have enough time to talk about that here. But let's kind of look at the crux of the lecture. I think this is where I want to end, by making sort of three important points. And the first is this. So basically, why should you care about everything I say? Well, basically, I'm going to guess, based on the fact that this is a Catholic church located right across the street from a Catholic college, that most of you guys here are Catholic, and if you're not Catholic, you're some other type of Christian. And so as a result, you take the Bible and you take the general tradition of the church as sort of like the starting point for your view on truth. Remember what I said at the beginning of my lecture, the emotions are an important part of daily life for us as humans, just based on what we are as humans. And so we need to examine this. We need to understand what it means to have emotions. And so, but the thing is, what sort of standard are you using to judge? And now again, what I said is the general consensus among Catholic theologians. Not every Catholic theologian, though, necessarily agrees on all of the nitty-gritties and all of the specifics of this. But the thing is, there are certain general trends that you will see. And the reason why you see those trends is because they're rooted in certain principles about the nature of the human person that come from Scripture, that come from the tradition of the church, which were revealed to us by God, who is the author of truth. And so, the thing is though, if you want to make judgments about the inner emotional life of man, something so integral to the human person, why not have principles that are rooted in the truth? Another thing to keep in mind is, I honestly think when you kind of really examine the Thomistic view and just the Catholic view, in light of certain current trends in science, I think we're getting to a point to where the time is ripe for some sort of dialogue between science and psychology on the one hand, and religion and philosophy on the other. So, actually, it's interesting though, because you see this especially when you talk about the sensation of pain. So a lot of people, for example, they talk about acute pain, which is, I hit my thumb with a hammer and that initial sensation. But then you have like chronic pain, which is sort of like long-term recurring pain, right? And the thing is, scientists have really started to analyze that from new perspectives over the course of the past century. So you go back to the French philosopher and scientist René Descartes in the 1600s. He basically believed that we hold a part of our body that sends signals through a series of fibers. He didn't really know about nerves, but he thought there were fibers, like these muscle-like things that connected that part of the body to a particular part of the brain, which then created the sensation of pain. So that, and if you experienced chronic pain, that was essentially like whatever was physically wrong with this or that part of the body was still going on, right? Now his view was highly reductionistic, so as he reduced all things to the physical. Now Descartes actually believed in the soul, but the thing about Descartes is he believed that the sensation of pain, anything outside of the intellectual life of man, was purely physical. You skip ahead to the late 19th century. You see the psychologist Sigmund Freud, and Freud basically, he took a more psychological approach. He believed that when there was some sort of unresolved emotional problem, that sometimes manifested itself as physical pain because that was more bearable for us. You skip ahead to the 1950s, the psychologist George Engel, he claimed that if we experience a particular type of pain that's traumatic enough, and then we experience it in a certain very specific context, we'll associate the pain with the context, and so whenever we're in that context, that'll sort of trigger the pain. You skip ahead to like the 1980s, you saw two psychologists named Blumer and Heilbrunn who suggested that chronic pain was actually a type of major depression. Most of these theories are seen as debunked, but what this started is the general trend that basically claimed there doesn't have to always be an explicit physical cause of pain. And again, it's interesting because you go to the 1960s and you saw the scientists Ronald Metzak and Patrick Wall who suggested that basically what happens, not to get too overly scientific, but there's something in the spinal cord called the dorsal horn, which is basically responsible for receiving sense perceptions, and basically it, like whenever you experience pain, the nerve signals go to the dorsal fin, which then sends it to the brain, but then based on our cognitive states, based on our emotional and mental states, that determines how long the pain continues to get sent up to the brain and how intense it is. So in the right cognitive state, basically the initial injury or disease could go away, but the dorsal fin will continue to send those sorts of signals and the brain will still continue to receive it based on our emotional and cognitive state. Again, another theory is known as the Biopsychosocial Model, which essentially says that we adopt certain types of behavior, such as injury, such as limping or being bedridden, as a way to cope with pain, yet these behaviors can remain even after the initial pain goes away, because it's basically like a maladaptation. Like we begin to adapt those behaviors due to negative reinforcements. It's like you get sympathy, so as a result you're going to continue that. So again, none of this in and of itself is really an endorsement of the Catholic view or the Thomistic view or the Christian view, but basically what the study of the emotions and of pain does, or what these particular discussions do, is they prove that we're sort of moving away from a purely reductionist view. And I think it sort of shows that, again, when you take, like science and philosophy, particularly Catholic philosophy, can sort of like complement each other. Because I think Catholic thought and some of the trends in traditional philosophy, so of classical philosophy, can create an intellectual context, and in science can sort of nuance that. And so I think we're slowly but surely heading there. And finally, the one last thing I like to keep in mind is sort of the practical moral implications. So again, how can you use this in your day-to-day life? And the main way is to keep in mind that emotions, in large part, do have to do with what we choose and what we desire. Now, of course, there's elements of our emotions that are not, like necessarily conscious or controllable. That's a well-established fact within psychology and neurology. But the thing is, the more advanced the creature, the more you find that certain elements of its inner emotional life are controllable. Because that's the thing. That's the thing about humans, is we have reason, and we have a will, an intellect and a will. So that's why I said earlier, there's that distinction between multiple different types of appetite and multiple different types of apprehension, some of which are connected with reason, others of which are connected with the senses. But the thing is, though, because humans have reason can direct our emotional life and direct it towards a higher series of transcendent goods. We can, to some degree, and again, I'm not denying that there are genetic or hormonal or like subconscious sort of influences on our behavior, but to the extent that reason and will allow us to influence our emotional life to some degree, to any degree, we can actually control or influence how we respond to things, how we view things, and direct it towards the end of union with God. And that's really what makes the Catholic view unique, and the Christian view unique, is we believe that the end, the goal, the purpose of human life is union with God. And so the real question is not to abandon the emotions, not to get to an emotionless state, but how can the emotions be used to help us draw closer to God? And if you don't know how to regulate, if you don't know how to control your emotions, you'll always be in a state of having them control you. And unfortunately, the way it is with the human person is when we're not taking what the body, the emotions, the psyche, and directing it towards something higher or noble, it always degenerates like the lowest common denominator. And so the more we can kind of be aware of what it means to be an emotional being, who's also rational and spiritual, the more we can, make actually spiritually and morally informed decisions about how we want to live our life and whether or not we want to direct it towards a life of holiness and virtue. So that's my lecture for tonight. I just want to say thank you very much.
Kyle, you were right on time. Not bad.
Thank you.
Incredible. Okay, questions, thoughts, points of discussion, or disagreement?
I'm open to all of it.
You better be.
Yes, sir?
In my study of theology at Providence College over the years, I walked away with the idea that there are emotions, but it's the will that is the more important, and not to pay attention too much to the emotions, and that if you are on a spiritual or ascetic program, you would be more in control than if you were willy-nilly and just open to anything and you don't have any formation. So I think that's, I never paid too much attention to the emotions after that, and I do know they exist, and a good example would be this Canadian singer, Celine Dion, who sang at Las Vegas, and the song All By Myself, which was, I didn't realize it, but there is the mathematics of music and the modulation and the key shifts and all that that would produce a moment that would be very emotional.
Oh, man.
And in fact, she had to stop singing because she got emotional. So this is all understandable. And I thank you very much. You gave a very good, comprehensive lecture, and thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your questions and your comments. Actually, to kind of go in reverse order, when we talked about like music and the emotions of music, art and music is one of those interesting things because it can be emotional and visceral, but it can also be intellectual and spiritual. And that's actually something I'd like to discuss even more later on. I actually, a while ago, studied one of the sermons of St. Francis de Sales, and he actually talks about how, the beauty is intimately connected with truth and goodness. You know, a thing is beautiful insofar as it is true and insofar as it is good, or somehow reflects that which is true and good. And so even then, an understanding of beauty has to do with like, we perceive it through the intellect, and then the intellect communicates the goodness of what we perceive to the will. And so, again, if you take what I said at surface value and sort of take it to its extreme, it does lead to a sort of dried out, sort of hyper-intellectualist view. But I think in the West, particularly today, because of that hyper-intellectualist view, we tend to sort of make too sharp of a distinction between emotions and reason, you know, and tend to say emotions are just like this non-rational, irrational sort of response to stuff, whereas reason is, you know, think, you can make decisions, you know. Now, and I think unfortunately, even certain elements of Catholic theology, because one thing you need to know about the scholastics, which was a big influence in Catholic theology and still to some degree is that it's very systematic and very philosophically concise, you know? So it's very rational, and it's very philosophical. And so I think it's easy for scholasticism, particularly in the modern era, to become infected by a sort of quasi-enlightenment, quasi-rationalist view. But to get back to your first view, you were talking about don't really pay much attention to the emotions. And I think that sort of comes from a simplified view of sort of ascetical theology. So ascesis, sort of. And the thing is, we know, as I said, when we're not using reason to ennoble and life in the spirit, and I mean that in the biblical sense, when we're not using that to ennoble human life, then things tend to degenerate to the lowest common denominator. So that's why you can't allow yourself to be like the story of Jesus on the boat in the middle of the winds. You know, we can't allow ourselves to be like that, where it's like we're just being, you know, blown around and buffeted around by the winds and the waves and the sea of emotion. There is some sense in which we have the ability to control the emotions. But again, the thing is, and I think this is actually where the distinction comes in that I was talking about earlier, there's two types of appetite. There's intellectual appetite, and then there's sensory appetite. Sensory appetite is our inclination for or against certain usually perceptible goods. Whereas intellectual appetite has to do with our inclination for or against certain goods which may not necessarily be physical in nature. For example, you have things, and again, part of intellectual appetite is free will. You know, the capacity to make self-determined choices. And the thing is, though, the intellectual appetite needs to control. So it's not a matter of suppressing, because I'm guessing most of you would think that, you know, food is a good thing, right? And sleep is a good thing, and wearing clothes is a good thing. No one would say, go out naked in that weather out there, right? You know, and most people say, oh, well, if someone's like anorexic, we say there's something wrong with them. Why? Because not eating food is bad. So it's not a matter of saying, oh, the physical bodily desires are bad. It's a matter of learning how to regulate them and order them towards a higher good, which sometimes does include abandoning certain physical goods. Like, again, in like 6 weeks, we're going to be starting Lent, you know. So there is a place for ascesis. There is a place for giving up certain physical goods and sort of going to the bare minimum. But the thing is, you know, and again, it is true that when we start talking about intellectual appetite, that starts to be shaped and molded by the virtues, such as, you know, faith, hope, and love, which is what helps us get, of all the virtues, those three are the most directly connected to our relationship with God. But the thing you got to keep in mind is, it's not a matter of saying the intellectual and sensory appetite contradict, as much as finding ways to get them to cooperate with each other. So if that makes any sense? And unfortunately, kind of, when people talk about the ascetical life, they tend to kind of over-influence that, because basically what I think a lot of people are taught is based on an oversimplification of the monastic ideal, which I'm actually all in favor of. I think it's a good thing. I think we need to be living more simply, and I think the problem is we've gotten away from that ideal, but it's born, sometimes we oversimplify that kind of stuff. So if you get what I'm trying to say? So it's not a matter of making emotions go away, it's a matter of learning how to regulate them. And not getting more attached to, because all emotion is appetite to some degree. So it's a matter of not getting so attached to the lower appetites that we lose sight of the higher ones. So does that make sense? So.
But one would need a good ascetic lifestyle, such that, like a saying like, desire not to desire, or a day without suffering is a day lost.
Well, yes.
That kind of stuff where the person is aware and is on top of the situation and knows that an ongoing ascetic program is necessary to be in charge of your emotions.
Exactly, and I do actually agree with that point. I don't think that actually, I honestly don't think what you're trying to get at and what I'm trying to get at really contradict. Because I'll be honest, like, the will has the ability to control the appetite. The intellectual appetite can control the sensory appetite. And so sometimes, a lot of times, I think especially in today's world, we need more ascesis to do that. Because we have everything from, out of wedlock sex to an obesity epidemic to, so people today don't know how to control their desires. But it's not that desire is itself a bad thing. It's a matter of what do we desire and what are our priorities in desire. Because you can't get to heaven unless you desire something. What do you have to desire? You have to desire God, right? So so the reason why we need ascesis is to make sure that my desire to eat 10 cupcakes and fall into gluttony is not stronger than my desire to get to heaven. And I'm willing to say, no, I'm not going to eat any of that. Not that eating cupcakes is bad, but if I think doing that in a certain way, to a certain extent, in a certain situation is going to lead me away from God, I have to be willing to say no to that. And so you are right that the will and the intellect are in charge of the lower desires, so that we can, we know when to say yes and when to say no. And that's what separates us from the animals. And I hope that's sort of like the main point, is that in humans, there's two different types of appetites. The intellectual and the sensory. The sensory is, again, our desire for material things. And what the Christian ideal is that the intellectual appetite, the appetite for virtue and holiness and God, is sort of in control of our lower appetites. And sometimes you need a more extreme way to get there. Sometimes you need ascesis. Now, we're not all called to the monastic life, or to the religious life. So there are different ways to get there, but there is a need for that sort of monastic life, because sometimes you need to do that to get to that point where the intellect is in control. Yes?
You talked about the Baptists, and we have a lot of Baptists in this world, and we need to pay attention to them. But I think they concentrate more on not drinking alcohol, because John the Baptist didn't drink, okay? But if you think about 30 years he was in the desert, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, and just eating grasshoppers is not a very appetizing thing. Although I did see one time many years ago in Chicago a jar of grasshoppers for human consumption. I didn't buy it, but John the Baptist is an extremely good example that everybody overlooks.
Yeah.
And it's not what you know; it's who you know. He knew Jesus Christ and lost his head.
Yeah.
In spite of his friendship there, a relationship. So John the Baptist didn't wear fancy clothes, and the desert is very cold at night and it's very hot during the day, and there was no TV, and he didn't read the Bible, and he never said the rosary. So what did he do? So anyhow, he lived a very ascetic life, I assume, and
And yeah, I mean, the thing is though, I think there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing I think to unpack is that what the example John the Baptist shows is, in a rather extreme example, how asceticism can lead to holiness, and how sometimes we need that in our lives. I think the problem comes in when you say, oh, well, that's the only example of how to attain holiness. Not, again, I think there's people in the world who don't really get the monastic ideal, and so they end up saying, you know, whatever, like, do it. But again, I also think some people say there's, like, they choose their favorite biblical character and say that's the best model for living a gospel life. And I think you actually mentioned the example of John of the Baptist, where they'll oftentimes look at a small handful of biblical verses and say that proves you're not allowed to drink alcohol. But again, even like the Catholic Church doesn't say that drinking alcohol is bad, which is why it's morally acceptable as long as it doesn't lead to drunkenness. But even among Catholics, there are Catholics who have a more ascetical lifestyle who will have very restricted sort of amount, they'll highly restrict their alcohol consumption. Like, there's a monastic community up in Massachusetts near, they kind of like, I forget the exact name of the place where they are, but they're in a more rural area up in Boston. It's the St. Benedict's Monastery, and basically the thing about them is, like, they happen to be on the more stricter side of how they follow the rule of St. Benedict, which means they'll only drink alcohol on, like, mostly just wine on Sunday. Outside of Mass, they'll only drink alcohol on Sundays and, like, major holy days, and it's like one small glass. Whereas with other monastic communities, they may allow for, if you're a drunkard, they're going to say, okay, ship up or ship out, or shape up or ship out, you know. They don't let people get, but they still may be a little bit more lenient about alcohol consumption. So, I mean, in the Catholic Church, there is some people who will try to go, okay, maybe I'll just not drink alcohol or restrict my alcohol consumption. But I think they'll, especially in evangelical circles, I think they'll pick one issue and say that is the issue that is plaguing humanity, whether it be sex, drugs, or alcohol, and then they'll just say, when in reality, I think the one thing I like about being a Catholic is we have a holistic view, whereas we kind of see the big picture, but sometimes we see the big picture in a good way, but sometimes in a bad way, where it's like, it's all kind of an issue when we take it to an extreme. So you can't just focus on one vice and try to overcome it. Being a human means knowing about all of your desires, the full range of human desires, and learning how to manage them. You know? So.
Any other question from someone? This could be the last one if that's possible.
Actually, maybe two.
Wherever you like.
Look, we have just two, so yeah.
I don't like to keep them past 8, but they're fine to stay.
On your thoughts, there seems to be, and this has been, I think, pervasive in Western society for at least the last 50 years, of the primacy of emotions in moral decision making, so kind of emotive ethics, where it's emotions all the way down. How do we address that while still respecting the importance of the emotive experience as, you know, soul, body composites, but yet calling people to that higher truth that does exist, that is Jesus Christ and God, and all that it is in, you know, I guess the spiritual life.
Yeah, and that's actually a great question. And again, I think over the course, the part of this goes back to, you know, with the rise of idealism and phenomenology and existentialism, which tended to focus on sort of the first-person subjective experience of reality and the sort of the influence of that. And then all of a sudden, but over time, that then became the dominant element. God bless you. I think the best way to sort of counteract what you said is exactly by making the distinction that I mentioned earlier between the intellectual and the sensory. So it's not that humans, the central part of the Catholic view of the emotions is desires. So humans have sort of lower desires and higher desires. We also have the ability to make judgments, but again, we make judgments based on what set of principles? Is it those principles that are perceptible immediately to the senses? Like I see something and then I'm just making a judgment about whether or not to avoid or go towards it? Or is it, am I allowing myself to perceive higher realities and making judgments about those higher realities based on logical and metaphysical and spiritual claims? And so I think when you look at certain elements of contemporary ethics, the number one way to counteract that, there's two sides to it. There's the intellectual and there's the sensory, and basically saying, if you believe that, like, unless you believe in pure materialism, like what you physically see is all there is, unless you believe that, then you have to believe that there's something beyond the physical realm. And insofar as you believe that there's something beyond the physical realm, you believe that, there has to be some means by which we understand that which is not physical, and there's also the desire for that which is not physical. I mean, St. Augustine said, with regard specifically to God, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. We only know true peace and fulfillment in God, who is an immaterial reality. So ultimately, you have to ask yourself, it's not that we should disregard the emotions, but rather know that the emotions are centered on desire, and there's two levels of desire. That which concerns the intellect and that which concerns the body. And there's also two sets of judging stuff, one connected with reason and one connected with the senses. So as long as you keep in mind that distinction, you'll be able to find that right balance. Does that make sense? Or?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think we had a question from Sister.
There's just a quick comment. That was a great question because everybody used to, or I think we use our brain, right, to think, but now everything is I feel, instead of rather than what do you think? But that's just being an added comment.
The emotions have taken the place of the conscience.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I was just thinking of, I love St. John the Baptist, but always just to remember that Jesus' first miracle was to multiply the wine. And that's always great to be Catholic for that reason. But also that it's good to recognize your emotions because our sins, we're all one being, and so it's all related. And so if you don't pay attention to your emotions, we act out our emotions if we don't pay attention to them. So to be aware of your emotions and do emotional check-ins. I know that sounds really dumb, but you'll just to examine your conscience of what causes you to sin. What are you confessing in the confessional? And when you go, oh, okay, anxiety, and it's actually the things that you confess are just the symptoms. But if you go a little bit deeper and finding your emotions, if it makes any sense.
Yeah, and I think
Abraham Lowe is who I'm quoted, like.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a great point.
Yeah.
And again, like, one sign of emotional maturity is whether or not you know how to control your emotions. I mean, obviously, there are some people who, like, they just lash out because they're psychologically unstable. But there's also a lot of people who lash out because they're just not at the state of their development where they have the self-awareness to be able to control their emotions. So the thing you have to keep in mind is it's a major sign of both personal and emotional and intellectual and spiritual basically maturity, whether or not you know how you have enough self-awareness to be able to control your emotions. But when it comes to controlling or regulating, it's like, by what principles? By what standard? That's where the spiritual life comes in, right? I mean, that seems to be one common thread here as you start to think, all right, so there has to be a higher set of principles by which I judge, and where are you going to get those principles from? And in the Catholic view, in the final analysis, it's ultimately God or nothing, because every other way of doing things and viewing things reaches its fulfillment in God and in the truths that we know through the faith, which is a whole other lecture in and of itself, of religious epistemology. But So maybe like one more question, or?
I don't think so. If I was-
No, I don't want to stop the party. I mean, Cole, it's very enjoyable to listen to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, not just because you're a Thomist. You're very pleasant. Not everyone's pleasant when they give talks, you know? Very engaging.
Thank you.
No. Anyone else but Rayfield? Margaret. Last question, or second last, I don't care.
I think this was really timely because one thing that I've been thinking since the pandemic started is that the media especially is really trying to manipulate us into fear, anxiety, anger toward a division of people, and we see some acting out of that anger in, different reports and stuff, and I think they're playing us, I really think they're playing us, and Tim's comment reminded me about the abortion issue of, that it's, a lot of people like abortion because of their sympathy toward women, their sympathy for how they got into this situation. And so they feel like they're being good, like people who've been, their emotions have been played, feel righteous. They feel like they're being good people and doing good things by encouraging abortion or encouraging rioting or, encouraging putting down people because they're different than me. I think it can really can get played.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and unfortunately not all people really come to that realization, and not all people come to that realization to the same degree. There was one political commentator who said that among a lot of people, and you just happened to mention abortion, but I think it's true also with a lot of like the SJW types, the big emphasis is on fairness, which is fairness interpreted in this sort of very visceral kind of emotional way, but emotional in the sense of the lowest sense of emotion, like, just our baseline emotions, not even like the higher ways of thinking or evaluating. And so I think that underlines a lot of what people today are saying, and so you gotta learn how to speak to that and sort of draw people out of that. I think, as a side note, when it comes to the media is supposed to be, and I'm not going to start to get into all the stuff with COVID. First of all, I'm not a doctor. Second of all, I know that whatever I say, there's a 50-50 chance that every single one of you thinks the opposite of what I'm saying. So I don't want to start an argument. I want to have discussion.
But again, that's fine. But we don't seem to feel like that's fine, that someone thinks differently than me. Like that almost brings up more emotion.
Well, it's interesting though, because people, like I said, there's a distinction between the intellect and the sensory, and people oftentimes choose the sensory over the intellective. But I guess the number one issue with like the media, for example, is journalists are supposed to be people who record the facts. And even when you have, there's a difference between facts-based journalism and sort of like commentary-based journalism, and even with the latter, it's supposed to be these are supposed to be people who have moral insights to bear on the facts. But unfortunately, that's the ideal of what a journalist is supposed to be, and that's what journalists are trained to be. But unfortunately, everyone has an agenda, and people are more concerned with getting the agenda across, and it's very easy to get across that agenda through appealing to the lowest parts of human nature. And for example, that's why, and again, I would never morally promote it, but that's why I think there's a lot of, that music from the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of that protest music is really good at underscoring this point. I mean, again, his views and mine tend to be diametrically opposed, but I'm guessing that you guys have heard of that guitarist and singer Frank Zappa. Some of you have. If you're pretty much between the ages of if you're between the ages 50 and 75, you'll remember. So very famous guitarist back in the late 60s and 70s, but back in the early 70s, he released an album and it contained a song called "I'm This Line," which was specifically like an anti-media song, basically saying it's just a tool of the government and big business to control us. That's not how it's supposed to be, but that's what it's become. And I think both sides have been infected by this, which is why, for example, there's some outlets, even within Catholicism, which I don't really listen to anymore. Like it's sort of like the group of outlets, whether religious or secular, that I listen to on a regular basis is very much shrinking. Because I feel like, for example, there's some of these guys that become like basically just no different than the secular media. So, yes?
So on that particular point, this lecture would be great if you were to extend and apply it specifically to the dynamics by which successful business models in new media depend upon disordered emotions. So that there's no expectation that you're going into a neutral territory with respect to emotions or with respect to its a way of engaging your emotions. Successful news outlets are measured by revenue are going to be ones not that present truth, but rather that generate a response from you, a spontaneous click, because, well, ordinarily, it has triggered some emotion in you.
Yeah.
And whether that emotion is one of approval or sometimes more likely disapproval. So people will, this is a trouble in the media, because even, for example, our former professor at Providence College, Anthony Esselin, wrote an article for an online journal. And so he wrote the article, but the editor gave the title to it. And the title was a highly inflammatory title that he did not intend to, that didn't characterize the article, but it was the title that would generate clicks.
Yeah.
And people frequently don't read or don't read something before they click on it or share it or like it or whatever the case. Because too long didn't read it, but still, you don't have to in order to get the ad revenue that comes with the person clicking on it.
Exactly, and that's sort of like, I think that's the number one big issue, and that's right. I think someone's telling me to shut up.
No,
but let me actually.
okay?
Where's your husband on the some of this? Oh, it's him. Who's calling it?
Could be your conscience. Rachel's calling.
Yes. So he needs to communicate through digital means. So actually, as a side note, Professor Bay, I think you just gave me another idea for a lecture.
Excellent. Glad it happened here.
But by the way, I happen to have a list this long, so it's already getting too unwieldy, but thank you. But I have to say that's a good point, because everyone talks about that. It's like, if you're going to try to get approval, you have to appeal to the most, think about how they present food. Think about how they present, I'm not going to get into how they tend to advertise some things, because this is a Catholic church. But we all know how people tend to advertise things. And it's appealing to the most visceral parts of us. But again, that can only get you so far before you didn't get sick of it. So eventually, they have to start. Disapproval is much worse, is much more of a stronger emotion than approval. Which is, I think, the problem is that why there's so much hatred in today's society, because negative emotions, when taken to an extreme, can very easily lead to hatred. So I think that's a really good point, And again, the media is not doing its job. It's supposed to be either accurately representing facts or providing insight into the facts. But instead, it just, that's the thing. When people are either motivated by ideology, which it doesn't mean people are ever going to be unbiased, but when people are rooted in solely an agenda or in profits, then you've already gotten away from the mark. And that's why I also think another issue is what can reel that in is I think like the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, they should all have, in order to work there, you should have a degree in journalism plus a degree in something else, I think. Because you shouldn't be allowed to talk about science or religion or politics in a specific part of the world unless you've studied it. And the minute, if you're going to spend anywhere from 4 to 10 to almost 20 years of your life studying that before you can get a job, or at least a job you like, then that's going to really weed out some of the, less desirable liftback. Because I'm really sick of people who are like, don't know a whole lot about a field, lecturing about that field just because they know slightly more than someone else.
Now, you're
Yeah.
You said, or I think Father said you're teaching at the middle school level?
Yes.
So I'm thinking what kind of activities or education of the emotions would be helpful to prepare them for facing that kind of world in a responsible way.
Yeah.
I don't know, this is something which I have never given a single thought, I have no idea.
Well, I mean, I'll be completely honest. If you're talking about anyone between ages of like 14 and 18 and you're looking for something emotional, don't have to look very far. That's basically, that's 90% of it. Like, I've been working there for like a month and I've already had to like deal with this issue. So it's like, and then I also like, I know like 40-year-olds and 18-year-olds and 25-year-olds who still are dealing with this. So that is something to consider. I am thinking about it because it's about how do you reach these kids, I think whatever you do, it has to be something that kind of makes you step back and think.
Yeah.
Because I'm not saying over-intellectualize it, because that's not how you're going to reach a 16-year-old or 14-year-old. But the thing is, it has to be specifically designed to make them, and I think this is where Martin Heidegger was good, because Heidegger talks about how the human mind is shaped by the context within which we live, and there's a particular flow or way in which things are organized. And basically, humans don't really think much about it until something happens that disrupts the flow, causes us to sort of step back and then analyze it, which of course is very much of an oversimplification of Heideggerian thought. But the point is, whatever activities you do to get little kids to think about this, it has to be something that kind of has that effect, which is why the question is, what activities are you doing and what is the motivator? Like, what's the motivating set of principles? Which is why I honestly think, I believe long-term I'm called to teach on the college level, but I think what's pivotal is to pack the middle schools and the high schools and the elementary schools with people who have a solid set of principles. Because that's why the educational system is terrible, and that's why by the time they get to this part of town, they're completely lost. It's basically a lot of people, and I'm thinking about it and saying most of my students in 10 years, 4 years, they're gonna, if the 6th graders are gonna be here in 8 years, 10 years. The 8th graders are gonna be here in 4 years. In 4 years, they're gonna be where I was a few years ago. And it's just, when you think about it that way, it's like, but that's, I know, but it's also scary to think about the minute we set them free, that who knows what's gonna happen. So which is why, I know, I'm friends with a lot of college professors, I know the stuff that they say about the students, and it's like, well, if only someone had kind of guided them on the right path when they were 12,
That's your job.
Well, yeah, that's my job. Yeah, right now that's my job. So yeah, that's what I hope to do now. It's basically 6th grade teacher by day, college lecturer by night. So, but anyways, on that note, I'd like to thank you all for coming out.